I have discussed in this channel in previous videos: articulation, place of articulation, manner of articulation, the articulators. But there are also different types of articulation that can be distinguished from each other. They are categorized as different types based on how many points of articulation there are. So in the IPA chart, you will see the places or points of articulation bilabial. When you say bilabial, two lips are engaged, but they're engaged in one place, one point, one place where the articulation occurs. Obviously, in all of these, there are two articulators involved, but there is one point of articulation. So in the case of labiodentals, again, lips and teeth, but in the same place, and so on and so forth. Could there be more than a single place of articulation involved or single point of articulation involved? Yes. So when that happens, when there's 2 points of articulation involved, that is called co-articulation. Co-articulation means the 2 points of articulation are functioning together. Co-articulation itself is divided into 2 kinds of articulation: double articulation and secondary articulation. What I'm going to cover today is secondary co-articulation or secondary articulation. If the 2 points of articulation contribute equally to the articulation of the sound, it's called double articulation or co-articulation. But sometimes there's 2 points of articulation involved and one of them has a primary role and the other one has secondary. I know up to now this sounds kind of abstract, but now I'm going to give you specific examples of what secondary articulation is. Examples of secondary articulation are palatalization, velarization, pharyngealization, and labialization. For example, there is a video in which I discussed the dark L. In the pronunciation or in the articulation of the dark L, you have a primary articulation which you can figure out by looking at this consonant chart. So dark L is still a kind of L. So what are the phonetic features of L? It's a voice lateral approximant alveolar, right? But then you can velarize this. Do you see one of the processes, examples of secondary articulation is velarization. So if this undergoes velarization, it becomes a dark L. And in order to show that the L is a dark L, we use a diacritic. We use a secondary symbol on top of the primary symbol. So here the primary symbol is L. The secondary symbol is this tilde that goes through it. I said secondary articulation is a kind of co-articulation. 2 points of articulation are involved. The voice lateral approximant alveolar, that involves velarization, which is a secondary articulation. This occurs by the back of the tongue approaching the velum. Velarization occurs here as a secondary feature to the articulation to the voice lateral approximant alveolar, L, turning it into a dark L. So the primary one is alveolar ridge. What is the secondary? Velum. So why is it called secondary articulation and not double articulation? Because in this co-articulation, the primary articulation, which is alveolar ridge, is involved more significantly than the secondary feature. So basically the velum gives as an extra feature, which is in this case is the darkness of L, which sits on top of L. But even without it, it will still be an L. Sound would exist. So the main identity of this sound is that it's alveolar. The secondary identity is that it's velarized. So usually we use that IZE to make a verb: velarized, pharyngealized, palatalized, labialized. There are other examples of the dark L in English. It usually comes at the end of the word or syllable, like hell, null, bell, call, ball. You see in the word lull, the first L is not a dark L. What is the difference between the first L and the second L in this word? It's the secondary articulation. In the first L, there is no secondary articulation of velarization. In the second one is. As I said, secondary articulation is not limited to velarization. There's other processes. For example, there's a thing called pharyngealization, which is the constriction of the pharynx. Pharyngeal sounds are common in, for example, Arabic. I know the primary feature for the pharyngeal sound, which is, you see, a voiced pharyngeal fricative. I know that this is pronounced something like ah, like the letter is called ayn in Arabic. These are the different kinds of the letter ayn in Arabic in terms of form. The pronunciation is this. This is when it is the primary articulation. But other than this consonant in Arabic, it can also be used as a secondary articulation in other sounds, which means that Arabic has a pharyngeal sound, pharyngeal consonant, but there is also the process of pharyngealization sitting on top of other consonants in Arabic. For example, the word for mud in Arabic is something like tain. I'm not sure I can do the secondary articulation, but if you look at this very carefully, you would see that in the transcription, I have this pharyngeal being used as a superscript. So in IPA, we do this, we show it as a superscript when it is a secondary articulation. If it were not secondary articulation, it would not be superscripted. Do you remember, for example, for the word pad in English? We also did this. We used the aspiration as secondary articulation. This is an example of pharyngealization, another kind of secondary articulation in the language of Arabic. But also I introduced the fact that in the IPA, the way you use a symbol for secondary articulation can be superscript. But as you see in the case of the L, the secondary articulation was not a superscript. It was a tilde that went through the L. But in both cases, it was secondary in the way it was applied to the symbol. There was a primary symbol, then there is a secondary symbol, which can be superscripted to the top right of it, or it can go through it.